Alright, ladies and gentlemen, I said a few controversial things in my last video regarding PED usage in Olympic weightlifting, so I want to use this video as an opportunity to further break down my arguments, specifically my pro PED usage argument. So, going to dive further into that. First, I want to acknowledge that my solution proposition that I made in the last video is an acknowledgement of drug usage. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, I mean that these arguments begin with the understanding that PED usage within sport is entirely undeniable. So I want to get rid of some of the, uh, you know, delusional thoughts people have around PED usage, where at the elite levels within sport there are, or it's commonplace to see natural athletes, when that's just not the case at all. If you were to test every single athlete for every single drug under the sun at these Olympic Games, they would virtually all test positive. Are there some exceptions? Yes, but those are the black sheep. Those are the standouts. Those are the exceptions. Those are the 1% of the 1%ers. They are not the commonplace, and they are not who this argument is really designed around. But getting away from that, I want to acknowledge the fact that the second solution, the solution of allowing athletes to take performance-enhancing drugs in an unregulated way, or in a way where they won't be punished, not entirely unregulated, but they won't be punished. They won't be stripped of any winnings or earnings that they might receive for the usage of these drugs. And this is a devil's advocate argument. So I'm sort of thinking outside the box, I suppose you could say. So first, I want to acknowledge that the reasons I stand for this devil's advocate argument. One, and this is something I will fully admit that I got from Clarence Kennedy's video regarding performance-enhancing drugs. If you want to check that out, I highly recommend that you do. It's why he's against anti-doping. I got the thumbnail here, so go check that out. I'll leave a link in the description to check that video out. Great. Check it out. I'm not saying you have to agree with everything he says, but I think he proposes some good arguments and some interesting ones, and this was one of them, and one that I resonated with. Testing is not fair. Testing is not fair, and it's highly dependent on where you live in the world, specifically what country, your culture, what the feeling around performance-enhancing drugs are, the system you are working within. So, say for example, this is a real example. Say I'm an athlete competing in the United States. Let's say I get very good. I work my way up to a pretty high national level within weightlifting, and I want to compete at an international level. Well, I don't have the same state-funded support system that a Chinese athlete might, or that a North Korean athlete might, where I can trust that I'm being protected by my own government and can virtually do whatever I want and take whatever is given to me without fear of an international organization, like one hired by the IOC or WADA, coming in and drug testing me, because I'd be protected. Within the United States, I would be left entirely vulnerable, and within a lot of European countries, specifically Western European countries or Central European countries, I would be left vulnerable. Whereas if I lived in Soviet Russia, or even a modern Soviet era, when we had the early 2010s, around the London Olympics, your Dmitry Klokhovs, your Apkes, guys like them, clearly using performance-enhancing drugs, clearly state-funded, we're not necessarily getting caught. Second, I think there's an unimaginable amount of ways around being caught for performance-enhancing drugs that people aren't really willing to acknowledge. One kind of goes back to the last argument, in that when these PEDs are state-funded, and you have the protection of your own government and your own system, you can virtually find any way around it. One, mainly because you're not being drug tested. That'll go a long way, but say you are being drug tested. Icarus, the documentary, if you haven't seen that, I highly advise that you do. I think it can disillusion you to PED usage immensely. The Russians found incredible ways around it. Did they ultimately end up getting caught? Yes, but the lengths that these countries and these teams will go to avoid detection is incredible, and it is virtually endless. That goes into the third argument, which would be the evolution of the usage of these drugs. There's gene doping. That's a topic that I will acknowledge that I'm not necessarily educated on. There are people much more educated, and I would advise that you watch videos on that to get a better understanding, but that is an important element here. And beyond that, there's designer drugs and non-pharmaceutical grade drugs and newer drugs like SARMs that are being used, drugs that are entirely untested. The outcomes of using these drugs is completely unknown, and the danger level to these athletes is immense and frightening. So this is why ultimately the second argument becomes, or the second solution becomes important. It all comes back to athlete safety. On a surface level, as reckless of a solution and as dangerous of a solution as it seems, it's important because if you were to take steps to at least begin to introduce a way in which the production of these drugs could be acknowledged and then potentially moderated or regulated, introduce some type of standard for the production of these drugs, potentially, I'm not saying I'm guaranteeing it, as stated before, this is a devil's advocate argument and not one that needs to be completely entertained in its entirety. It could potentially increase the safety for these athletes. I want to make it entirely clear that it's not lost on me that this argument seems entirely counterintuitive. The fact that I'm saying weightlifting has a problem with PED usage that's going to jeopardize its spot in the Olympic Games, and then immediately doing a 180 and saying the solution is unfettered, rampant drug usage. But you have to understand what I'm saying is there is already unfettered, rampant drug usage. If you trust the IWC as an organization, or even the IOC as an organization, to properly moderate the usage of performance-enhancing drugs, I mean this in the most respectful way possible when I say you are absolutely out of your mind. At this Olympic Games, and at virtually every Olympic Games within the past 4 or 5, perhaps even 6 decades, drug usage has become absolutely rampant, and it is completely unregulated in a way that is jeopardizing the health and safety of these athletes. All I'm saying is it is important to acknowledge that, and it's not going to change. So something should be done about it to ensure that these athletes aren't dying prematurely from drugs that we really don't even know the long-term consequences of as they continue to evolve. I will acknowledge that this sort of opens up a rabbit hole of arguments, and it becomes a slippery slope, because then if you do allow PED usage and moderate it, people will then say, okay, well, these countries that already have an advantage and have a culture and system set up that allows for doping to occur without testing, they will still use better drugs, designer drugs that they think will work better. But again, it's a devil's advocate argument. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it's a stepping stone to a larger future solution, and one that will be better for the longevity of the athletes and their careers and their well-beings in general. So this is a stepping stone. As I said, not long-term. There are, I'm sure, plenty of issues that will arise if this was to actually happen. But I'm saying it's a solution to entertain. That is all. Last thing, really quick, I want to acknowledge before I go, because I left in a comment in my last video. I understand that there could be ramifications for amateur athletes, because many people might say, well, this will only incentivize people to get on steroids. But again, you have to acknowledge that this is an argument that only applies for elite athletes at the very top level, competing for a medal at the Olympics or the World Championships. So this doesn't necessarily apply to amateurs. And if you think someone who wants to be competing at the elite level is not already incentivized or tempted to start taking performance-enhancing drugs because people at that top level are already on performance-enhancing drugs, you're crazy. If you think that's not already a current issue, it's just one that's not necessarily being talked about. That's all I have to say for this video. Again, like I said in the last one, I think this was probably even more controversial than the last video I made, so that's gonna go over great. I'm looking forward to it. Let me know what you think. Again, it's really not that serious. It's just a devil's advocate argument that I think is good to entertain as some food for thought. But let me know what you think. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you dislike it. Have a great day. Thank you. Actually, one last thing. Just in case this might change your mind, I just want to remind you that without PEDs, we're never going to get a moment like this in weightlifting ever again. So I'll leave you with this one last clip. Have a nice day.